How often should you replace potting soil? So that's soil in outdoor containers as well as house plants. That's the focus of this video. Let me read a couple quotes that I found on the internet. Potting soil only lasts 2 to 3 years, even if it's unused. What they are suggesting is that if you go and buy a bag of potting soil and you don't open it, you just let it sit there for 3 years, it's no longer good. You got to throw it out and buy more. Here's another quote. Usually you need to change soil in indoor plants every 12 to 18 months. Now, before we have a close look at this topic, I want to introduce a couple plants that I really love. This is a star magnolia, and they're one of my favorite plants in the garden, especially for early spring flowers. And in front of them are one of my favorite bulbs, the daffodils. You can't go wrong with either of these plants, and star magnolias are perfect for smaller gardens. All right, back to potting soil. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a number of reasons why you might want to replace potting soil, and we'll try to understand them in detail so we know if they apply to your situation. And then I'll summarize it and give you some advice and tell you what I do with my potting soil. Here's a list of things we should consider. Can soil get old? What about the accumulated microbes and pathogens in soil? What about accumulated fertilizer, especially if you have hard water? And then there's the issue of diseases. Plant diseases will accumulate in that soil, so maybe that's a reason to get rid of them. And then there's nutrient deficiency. At some point, that soil runs out of nutrients. And finally, there's compaction. That soil slowly degrades and compacts, and we know plants don't grow in compacted soil. Does soil get old? Now, the focus of this video is on potting media. Now, at least in North America, potting media is some sort of organic mix, mostly peat moss, but it could also be core or decomposed wood. We're not talking about real soil here. So does this potting media get old? I don't know where that idea comes from, but it really can't get old. Now, it can start to decompose. Remember, it's organic matter. So it can decompose and get less over time, but that doesn't necessarily cause a problem with plants. So in general, when people say it gets old, that's just complete nonsense. Potting media doesn't get old. And in case you're wondering, the soil in your garden doesn't get old either. In fact, if you're growing things in it, it's actually getting better, not worse. The next concern I see is microbes. A lot of these potting medias are sold with the word sterile on them. Well, that's not true. Nothing that you buy for your plants is sterile. And once you take that soil and put it in the pot and put a plant in, you've added all kinds of microbes. Those plants are covered in microbes. Your hands that you use to put the soil in there are covered in microbes. And they're floating all around the air around you. Within days, that potting media is full of growing microbes. You can't help that. And in fact, it's a good thing. Out in the garden, people strive to improve the microbe population. And for some reason on houseplants, people don't want microbes. Forget the microbes. They're there and there's nothing you can do about it. If you replace the soil, you're not getting rid of them. What about fertilizer accumulation? Well, there are two potential problems here. One is that you just fertilize too much and you do get an accumulation. Well, stop fertilizing and that will solve that problem. Okay? That's just bad culture if that's an issue. What I generally recommend is to fertilize every time you water, and then once a month just use straight water, and that will wash out the excess nutrients. And when you use that fresh water, make sure it runs out the bottom of the pot. Right? That cleans the soil. Now, there is an issue if you have hard water. So hard water has a lot of calcium and or magnesium in it. And calcium and magnesium tend to create insoluble salts with things like carbonates and phosphates. And what happens is that you actually get white stuff precipitating in the soil. very similar to what happens inside the kettle when you're boiling water. It's that white deposit. And you can also get that in potting soil. Now that can be a problem for plants, and over time it accumulates, so you have more and more of it. But most of it accumulates on the surface of the soil, the top layer of that pot. To overcome this problem, what you can do is that every year or two, scrape the top ½ inch off and get rid of that. And that will get rid of most of these precipitated salts. What about diseases? Gardeners are really worried about their plants getting sick and getting a disease. Well, it does happen, but it's not as frequent as people think. And most of the diseases are not that harmful to the plants. Now, if you have a plant in a container and it gets a particular disease, and you've identified that disease, and it's one of these that's very deadly to plants, and it lives in the soil, so it's usually a disease that attacks roots, well, then it might be a good idea to get rid of that potting media. Throw away the pot at the same time, or wash it really well. And you probably also have to throw out the plant. If you take a diseased plant, put it in fresh potting media, you're going to transfer the disease to the new potting media, so that doesn't make any sense. If you have one of these diseases that's really deadly, throw the whole thing away. Plant, pot, and media. But I'll tell you, that's a pretty rare occurrence. Most diseases don't fall into that category. If you can't identify the disease, assume it's one of these that's not very harmful to plants, and don't worry about the potting media. What about a nutrient deficiency? Most potting media has no nutrients in it. Peat moss supplies very few nutrients to plants. Same with coir, and wood products are probably even worse. Some manufacturers will add fertilizer to the media, and then the bag will say that it has added fertilizer. But that is generally a slow-release fertilizer, only lasts a couple months. My advice to you is that if you're growing in containers, either outside or in the house, you have to fertilize yourself. That fertilizer that the manufacturer adds is very low and is not going to do your plants a lot of good. So the last issue is compaction, and that can be a problem. If you start with peat moss, it's nice and light and fluffy, and over time, because it's organic, it does slowly degrade, and the particles get finer and finer and finer. So at some point, you might want to replace that media or part of it, but that really depends on the type of plant you're growing. Many plants will grow just fine in that media. But if you're growing plants that are really fussy and want a really airy media, then it's a potential problem. Now, one way around it is add a little more perlite, and that potting media is still good to use. So I want to return back to some of these quotes that I read at the beginning. The first one is, potting soil only lasts 2 to 3 years, even if it's unused. That's complete nonsense. If you take peat moss or coir and put it in a plastic bag and let it sit there for 20 years, provided it's dry, it's still good. It hasn't changed. Organic matter has a really hard time decomposing when it's dry and in a plastic bag. The other quote was, usually you need to change the soil every 12 to 18 months. That's written by someone who has no idea what they're talking about. We just went through the list of 6 common reasons why you might want to replace potting media. And except for the disease one, you can ignore them all. Potting media lasts a long time in pots. If you're repotting something and you want to add some fresh stuff, well, take 10%, 20% of the old media and throw it away. Once it's 5, 6 years old, add a little bit of new stuff, but you don't have to do that. In most cases, you can reuse the potting media for many, many years. Now, there are a few exceptions. If you're growing orchids, you're using a media that's chunky, large chunks of media compared to peat moss. And when that breaks down, it does compact too much. So orchids is an exception. repot those every 2 years. And I'm sure there are some other plants that are exceptions. They just cannot handle that compaction, that decomposition that's taking place. But for 95% of the things you grow, you can reuse that media over and over and over again for many years. And that's exactly what I do. Now, a number of years ago, I started writing about garden myths like this one about replacing potting media. And I put them together in a book, Garden Myths Book 1, and I now have a Book 2 out. Each one has about 120 myths in it. And what a lot of people tell me is that this book saved them money. When I debunk a lot of these myths, I'll be showing you how not to buy stuff. A lot of the stuff on the internet is trying to sell you stuff you don't need. And once you understand the myths, you realize you don't have to buy that stuff. So a lot of my friends love this book because it saves them money. These books are available worldwide through Amazon, and I know they'll save you some money too.